All right, it's time to get started for class. So last week we had some good discussion and didn't get through all the parables that I had planned, and so this week I planned for a fewer number to try to make it through. So you have to still hold your end of the bargain on the good discussion part. So otherwise we're going to run out of material for the time. But I do want a couple of the parables that we're going to look at this morning are a little bit longer in the read part of it. They're some of the ones that we've looked at, sometimes they're just 2 verses tops, and others are rather lengthy stories that he tells with the meaning attached to it. And that's what we're going to look at this time. So far, we've looked at, a few weeks back, we looked at the parable of the salt and the light, the lamp on the stand, the speck versus the plank, which is always a difficult one for all of us because it ends up stepping on your toes when you look at it really open-heartedly and really let it kind of read the way it's supposed to read to you. There's a lot out of that one. We looked at the several heaven is like, or the kingdom of heaven is like, those kind of rapid fire ones in Matthew. And then last week we were looking at a couple different ones, a couple weeks back, weeds among the wheat, the mustard seed and the yeast. And then we got into it looks like I skipped over that one. The last one we had on there was the lost sheep. And that's where we kind of left things off, was the lost sheep. That one was a kind of a challenging one when you really get into it, because it makes you kind of wonder, and I think Rick brought up a good point that, based on when you look at the 99 that are left behind, it may be actually harder to define who the 99 who are still following him than it is the one who lost, because so many of us fall into that category of being the wandering sheep and needing him to bring us home. And so while often we think of ourselves maybe as the ones, and I think there are times in our lives where we are fully dedicated to Christ. And I wouldn't say there's never a time that we're there and in his, sheltered care or whatever, and we watch other people who are drifting away. But there's other times that we might be the one that are starting to wander, and he has to go get us. And so we follow on both sides of that at various times. And so that one becomes kind of an interesting one, because the tendency can be to be like the other stories we've seen where Christ talks about the prodigal son. There can be that time where it feels like, yeah, but I never did all these things. Kind of that poor me attitude of I was the one that was always on your side. I was this, and forgetting that no, too, we also needed his forgiveness, and we fall into that category as well. Matthew chapter 15. We'll get to a couple more passages here shortly, but this particular one, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. Actually, you know what? And I look at this. This is not, did I send you this one? This is last week's. I don't know if another thing, but this is where we started last week. I don't know if you can, we'll get to that one. Let me go ahead and just read this one. Actually, the first verse we were going to read is out of Matthew chapter 18, verse 21, which I've actually had Josh scheduled to read for us. So if you're ready for that one, we'll go ahead and have you read.
Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother he sinned against him? Up to 7 times.
All right.
Back to you, my
So,
friend.
thank you. So we're in Matthew chapter 18, if you want to turn to those, verse 21. So again, Peter is the one who kind of asked this question, and it's really kind of this idea of how much forgiveness are we willing to really extend? Where's the limit of this? Christ has been teaching them to be forgiving, to be the one who reaches out and extends forgiveness to other people. His question says basically, okay, how many times is too much? At what point in time do we call it? Do we do 7 times? I mean, that's a lot. And if you really think about it, 7 is actually quite generous in the scheme of it, without anything on there. Let's see if this is the one. Yeah, there we are. So how many times? Up to 7 times? If that's a lot to have a person do the same act over and over and over again. 4 times is quite a bit. 5 times is quite a bit. 6 times is a lot. 7 times, do I still forgive them? At what point in time? We have that phrase, what's the one phrase that comes to your mind that kind of everyone uses just without context to church, but when you hear people talk about things, they'll say, fool me once, shame on me, or shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. This idea, it's like, okay, what about 7 times? And I think that's kind of the idea there is it really, a shame on me kind of a situation if I keep forgiving somebody? Is this 7 times? Is that too much? And I think he's kind of got that same, and oftentimes I find myself in a position of having to remind myself, they looked just like us. They thought just like us. They were human. They were people. They just lived in a different century. And it's so hard for us to place ourselves 2,000 years ago and imagine that their mind worked the same way ours work. We're not more advanced as a people. We have more technology at our disposal. We're just people. They were just people. And he listens, listen to what the question really of Peter is asking is, how many times should I do this? You're saying forgive, but like how much? 7? That's a lot. I mean, he's already kind of, in his mind, he's being generous. I think he almost thinks he's going too far. Up to 7 times? And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77. Or another, we'll say 70 times 7, which would be 490. I mean, that's, there's a huge amount, regardless of whether it's 77 or 490, it's not really an extended number of that. First of all, the odds of somebody actually doing the exact same thing to you and asking for forgiveness 7 times is low. 77 or 490 times is even lower. I mean, he's basically saying, no limit. Just keep forgiving them. It's not your job to stop forgiveness. It's not your job to decide where forgiveness ends. He goes on and says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Okay, I don't know how somebody ends up, and he tells an outlandish story here. I understand that, when we read this guy owes 10,000 bags of gold. How do you get into debt back then under 10,000 bags of gold worth of debt, and somebody keeps lending you more gold? And so he's kind of showing him how outlandish this forgiveness can be on there. And so he says, since he was not able to pay, the master had ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. I don't know whether he could or not, or if it was an empty promise, that's kind of irrelevant at this point. What's important is that he asked for forgiveness. And he says the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. And this debt, which stood against him, condemning his entire family, it was such a huge debt, was completely canceled, and he's free to go. So, what's his reaction? He should be overjoyed, joyously going about this. This thing when somebody, it's kind of a funny thing that happens. Somebody does a nice thing for the person in the car behind them in a drive-through, and then you feel like you've got to keep doing that. There's the one person who came there just to buy a dollar's worth of stuff and pays the $20 thing behind him. They were like, I wasn't even choosing to do this, but that idea of like, that whole pay it forward concept is kind of it's always you just keep going one more step with that. There's no paying it forward in this story. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Not 10,000 bags of gold, 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. Very similar story. Small, paltry sum, and he's being treated the exact same way, almost worse in this sense than the first one. But he refused. Instead, he went off and he had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. I don't know how you make money in prison to pay back the debt. So I don't know if this is just kind of a permanent, that you're out of luck here until somebody comes and finds a way to pay it for you. But when the other servants saw what had happened, and they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. And then shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. All right. Oh, whose toes ready to be stepped on first, right? This is one of those, they're all out there just getting trampled all over, because look at what it actually is saying. This has nothing to do with dollars. This has nothing to do with silver and gold. This has nothing to do with material items. This has to do with a heart issue of God has forgiven us a debt we could not pay, a debt that stood against us condemned, as we talked about just an hour ago, that we were on track for a certain death in hell. I mean, that's all we were earned on what our lives had gotten us. That's where we'd gotten ourselves. And Christ, on our behalf, pays that debt, cancels it. And all we had to do was ask him to. And it's just taken away. Similar setup to this story. And then what is our reaction on behalf of that? So how can something similar happen to us if we aren't careful? What would it look like? What would it look like for us to be this story lived out? Any thoughts on that? I mean, what specific things would we be guilty of? Not necessarily, again, I don't think we have a lot of us owing each other money, on a day in, day out basis, and certainly not 10,000 bags of gold. I don't know who has that to dish it out first to begin with. But, the idea here is, who would have given their servant that much anyway? But there was a huge, huge cost of something that was taken away from all of us. What do we then turn around and in a paltry amount turn around and refuse to forgive others of? Yeah.
I mean, just someone said something that hurt my feelings 5 years ago, and I can't let it go.
Yeah.
I don't trust that person because they said something bad about me years ago. I mean, to me, it's that,
Yeah.
right? Or similar.
And what's worse is when they asked for forgiveness, you said they did, and then you bring it back up. It's like, okay, did you forgive from your heart? Remember now, listen to let's go back, because I think this is an important thing on there. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you. Thrown into prison to be tortured. All of your debts, they're back on. Canceled? Now they're uncanceled. I'm canceling the cancellation. This kind of idea that you're put back in there unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. I think it goes to that point of something small like this. He wants a total attitude change of our hearts. All right, so it could be something as simple as that. It can be something of, I don't trust this person because years ago they did this thing that was sinful. And, they broke the commands of God, and therefore they're forever a sinner in my mind. God is viewing them differently, but I know their past. Well, so does God, and he looks at them differently. Where is it? Again, this comes back to that plank and speck and all these other parables that Jesus is talking about. We are not the judge in this, in any of these situations. We're not to be the one to judge. Our job is to do what? Forgive. That's it. Our job is to love one another. Our job is to forgive as we've been forgiven. That's it. I mean, our job is to be on the, we get to be, the good cop in all of this. I mean, we basically, it's, you're forgiven, you're forgiven, you're forgiven. 77 times if we need to. That's where we come in. Notice this was all prompted from the question, how many times should I forgive them? Well, what if they said something and then they said it again? Well, see, they never stopped actually thinking. And then you justify and rationalize why forgiveness isn't really deserved by them, as though any of us deserve it. And so we have these thresholds of that. Yeah.
Luke's parallel of this parable says that if one abuses you 7 times in one day, then you're supposed and ask for repentance each time, or forgiveness each time. You're supposed to forgive them those 7 times. That's just in one day. But this is amazing from a human perspective, in that
I think this is very clearly not human nature. I mean, this is God's nature at work, which is amazing about it, because you're right, that the idea that we forgive another person, it's giving us the opportunity to grow into a God-like, Christ-like personality that wouldn't be our natural self. And it allows us to experience the spiritual side of forgiveness from our own perspective. We get to experience the joy of being forgiven, but we get to experience what God gets to do, and chooses to do on our behalf, which is to forgive others. Yet what do we do with that? We have that grudge, that begrudgingly way of like, well, fine, I'll forgive you, but don't do it again. I'm only going to forgive you once for this. Yeah.
I'll forgive, but I won't forget.
Yes.
And that's kind of if we're honest with ourselves, that's the way we prefer to go with it.
Yeah.
I'm going to forgive you, but like you said earlier, well, I'm going to keep my eye on because you might do it again.
Yeah. And we think they will, really. I mean, because that's who they are, yeah. And again, that's not the right way to do it, but that's what we do, yeah.
And really, it's healthier for our inner being, because to hold that animosity is not healthy.
Years ago, I was when I was working in Knoxville, Tennessee, I was at church there, and I think I've told this story maybe once or twice before. It was probably one of the most painful experiences to witness. There was a guy who was there who had a lot of, his family had gone through a lot with a neighbor. Like, there was a lot of really bad things that had gone on. And he finally got to the point where kind of doing a class on forgiveness at the time. And I remember, he was just stood up and he was like, well, here's the deal. I think there's a point where you can and you can't forgive, and I'm not forgiving that. And he was just adamant about it. And I was visiting still technically that day, and I was like, I can't just sit by quietly on this one. I'm like, actually, you got to. I'm like, it doesn't matter how bad it is. Like, that's not our choice. It's only hurting you. It's going to tear your family apart if you don't forgive them. Like, you can't do that. And a lot of us have had that. I mean, I could go back into my younger days, and there was on one side of my family, there was some strife that was like that. And it was what he was describing. I'm like, just short of when the neighbor tried to shoot at them. Like, that was the only detail of his entire story that I couldn't have, like, matched one for one for. I'm like, that's not enough of a difference, to just try to, say that, okay, therefore I've hit a point where, because, maybe that's number 77. You still have to forgive. There are so many things about that I think if you look at it, there are some people who will test your patience on that. They will test your willingness and ability to forgive, and they are going to push every single button you have, and ones you didn't even know you had. They will find buttons to push on you to try to see if you're really willing to do this. And the great thing about it is the opportunity we have is that we can still forgive. And importantly, we can still forget, too. There are things that still that will get brought up from years ago. I mean, I think everybody has had a moment in time where they may have butted heads with another person. They may have had that. If there are still negativity being held onto from years ago, it's in everybody's individual best interest. It's in the church's best interest. Move on, forgive, and really forget. Move on into something greater, which is love and unity. Which is what I think we've been called to.
What if forgiveness isn't asked of us?
There is a challenge, right?
What if they continue to have it in their hearts, that they're right?
So what is actually said in this parable?
Turn the other cheek.
Well, no, I mean, the one that we just read, you're right, in other places it is, but in this particular one, what happened in the case of the first guy who had 10,000 bags of gold? He asked and begged for forgiveness when the punishment was coming his way. When the second guy comes in there, he comes in and he was just accosted for it, and he says, give me some more time. The thing about this one is these particular incidences are clear, undeniable, one's right, one's wrong, in the sense of a debt is owed. You're bringing up a grayer area on there, which is honestly an area that we're going to find ourselves in. So what do we do with that when somebody isn't asking for forgiveness? Do we withhold forgiveness waiting for them to do it? Or do we not worry about whether or not they understand they need the forgiveness and forgive them anyway. Which, I mean, really when we step back and look at it like that, which is the more Christ-like way of doing it? When we come to Christ and we ask for forgiveness, do we understand everything that we've actually done wrong? I don't think so. And so what do we often pray? Forgive us our sins and the sins that we've committed in ignorance or whatever, that we don't even know, because we don't want to be guilty of things that we're not even aware of. That's their heart issue that needs to change there, if they're not willing to admit to their faults. Our heart issue, or your heart issue in this situation, that if you use you as like the example here, if somebody's doing this to you, your heart issue is, are you still willing to forgive? Not saying it's conditional on their reaching a point where I feel like they've earned it. Because forgiveness was never earned by us. It's not going to be earned by the other either. And so that's something it's a challenge. I mean, it's always easier said than done. That's for sure, right? Yeah.
Well, it may go with this next thought, but just the contrast between what the first person owed and what the second person owed is just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I've got a note that says the first guy owed the amount of money that it would take him 150,000 years as a day laborer to pay back.
Yeah.
Right, so 150,000 years of my work, and then I could pay it back, right? So completely impossible.
Right.
And the other guy owes him a third of a year's wages, right? And what we're talking about is no matter what they have done to me, right? They hurt my feelings, they said something bad about me. How does that compare to what I have done to God? And that's the part that we have a hard time with, right? It's because I always discount. It's like when I'm driving, right? If you drive in a way that I think is stupid, it's really, really egregious.
Right.
I can do the same thing, and I had a good reason for doing it.
Exactly.
And that's the way we drive, right? That's the way I don't know if that's
No, it's way we all drive. Yeah.
Dad, didn't you just do that same thing? No, it was different.
Yes.
Well, that's what we do.
He needs to use his blinker. I don't have to. No.
I was gonna.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny because we can laugh about these things, but when you really get down to it, I mean, these are real, true things that happen. The debts that we've had canceled, that legal indebtedness that we could not pay, it was 150,000 years worth of our work to try to pay it back. I mean, there was no chance we were paying back the debts that we've racked up in our sinful existence. The things that we have done are so far removed from what Christ said. Yeah.
Matt, I just wanted to say something. I went through a period of time where I was really struggling with forgiveness, and I was under the impression that if I forgive them, I had to trust them. And what I learned was they're not the same thing. You can forgive somebody, but that doesn't mean that you have to trust them.
Yeah. That is a good distinction too, because trust is earned by other people, and I think that is absolutely true, because there is a certain amount of we have to be smart about things. We can't let ourselves be put back into a situation. The difference is harboring, like let's say in the case of forgiveness, harboring resentment, harboring negative feelings toward them, understanding that, okay, it's in my best interest, and I don't know the exact situation, so let me just use kind of another example that might kind of highlight this. If one of us, breaks a law and there's a consequence to it, that we have to then re-earn our right. Let's say let's say that Rick's driving is so horrific, he's unaware of it. That he brought up driving. I know. Look, I've seen it, right? No. Let's just say it's so horrific that he loses his license for a while over it. The government isn't yet going to trust him. Now, if he does everything he's done and he's got that kind of paid back or whatever, at some point in time, it's off of his record and he's been forgiven of those things, and it takes a while for him to then regain and earn his ability and his right to drive again. Put that into a human relationship. There may be a time that after forgiving somebody that we aren't yet at the point where we have full trust in them, because trust is something that is earned. Maybe we give them small opportunities to earn it back. That's where forgiveness would come in, if giving them an opportunity to regain that trust. Trust is different than forgetting, which is really hard because the forgetting of the sin is, I'm not going to bring it up. I'm not going to hold it against you. We would lie to ourselves if we said that we could actually erase it from our memories. That is our human limitation, that it's always there. We know. But when we hold that against them, now we have to be really careful on this because this is a very tight balancing act between not immediately giving full trust back to somebody in this situation and also still truly forgiving that person. Truly forgiving and releasing any guilt and harboring of negative feelings and hard feelings is forgiveness, to where you can restore loving that person. Fully trusting them to be able to act correctly until they've shown that they can is different. And I know it almost sounds like it's a little bit of double talk, but there is a very fine line that we need to understand, that we've got to figure out where that is. Because there's a lot of times, and I think this comes into a lot of issues, that certain people's behaviors may be patterns that we need to be aware of, and especially when it gets into the side of dangerous behaviors, that we need to be aware and not be naive to that side of it. But that is different than forgiveness. So I appreciate you bringing it up, because I think that's a really important distinction there, and it's a hard distinction to really limit down, because we don't want to limit forgiveness at all. And if they keep making that mistake, we still have to find a way to forgive them of something that we may not even trust them over. But that's different, and that's what's really a challenge on that one. I know, if anybody's got the exact takeaway on that one, that is the most difficult probably of the gray areas when it comes to forgiveness. Yeah.
I think a lot of times, and maybe I'm not reading this correctly, but sometimes I think we set ourselves up to be in a position where we have to forgive, or we should forgive, and it's not necessary. And what I'm trying to say is, if you're going to loan somebody money, for instance, and they're kind of shady, don't loan money expecting to get it back. If they pay you back, that's great, but don't make it a situation where you have to forgive them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's almost like you're pre-forgiving them, like allowing forgiveness to be there ready. Like, I don't.
Don't put yourself in that position where you're going to lose sleep over it if you believe that they're the kind of person that may not pay you back. You don't have to loan them the money. You can say no. But if you're going to loan them the money, forgive them ahead of time if they don't pay you back. And I think that's kind of the way with a lot of situations other than money. If you've given and given and given to somebody, that's kind of breaking your heart about, not doing what you think they
Yeah.
should in order to keep your friendship or your relationship, then kind of walk away from that. Forgive them and then don't allow them to hurt you.
Yeah, in some situations, it's an enabling, and so there's an issue there, that comes in as well. Let me say something, see if this kind of goes along with what you're thinking. Not so much even pre-forgiveness, it's generosity is what you're doing. You're looking at that you're being generous with them. Now, here's the catch to this. Okay, let's say they come and pay you back. If they pay you back, how do you treat them? If you treat them as though, I didn't even think you'd pay me this back, kind of attitude toward them, you can almost show them that you've never really had a forgiving heart to them. Graciously accepting their payback can also be a way of doing that. And so, again, it's all, how do we approach people with the right heart? Do you have your hand up as well? Yeah.
I had a friend years ago who used to say, people ask me, loan me $10, and I'll say, I won't want it, I'll give it to you.
A lot of times that is I say maybe the easier way to work with people, and that way it doesn't allow for the problems to creep in that forces you then to have to call in their debt or forgive them, one of the two, of that. So, yeah.
I just think, with the trust and with all of this, it really is a hard issue, and at some level, it is most awful moment, as far as we know, of his existence, right? 3 days later, they were walking on the beach, and Jesus said, "Feed my sheep," to Peter, to the dude who abandoned him when he was in his, right? He trusted him, right? And this is all hard, and that was Jesus, right? But I think this is a progression for us, and it is hard. This is probably I don't know, I can't speak to everything, but I imagine this is the hardest thing we're called to do, right?
Oh, I'd agree, yeah.
I think this is just it. And especially when our logic and our human reasoning says, no, restitution should be given, right? And our legal system says restitution should be given. And our whole society goes one direction. And Jesus says, forgive them like I forgave you, right? It's just,
Remember,
I guess I'm trying to, we have to try to get there without beating ourselves up for not being 100% there yet.
yeah,
That's what I'm,
agreed. And yeah, this is where we want to be.
Right.
This is kind of our,
the direction we need to be moving.
right. If we were perfect,
Right.
we don't need Christ, but we do. And so we realize we have to allow ourselves, and maybe allow a little forgiveness of our own self of not being perfect on this one as well. But remember too, the very first verse of this entire parable was, how many times if my brother comes to me? This was talking about really within the confines of the church specifically in this case, or in the confines of the family unit kind of a thing. I think we could easily apply this, way beyond out into the shady characters of the world and everything, who are completely ruled by by the ways of Satan and his dark dominion. Okay, that's going to be a little bit more difficult to apply this exactly. We're talking about people who have been forgiven, by God, and yet we're not willing to forgive them. I think that's really and truly, in light of it, specifically who's being talked about here. Doesn't mean we don't extend it on beyond there, but this is really truly talking about that particular situation. On this one, I kind of talked about what debts we've had canceled. I think there's a lot to that. I mean, we'd run out of time if we tried to list everything that we've had canceled on there. So I said, how should we treat others who are just coming to Christ, still loaded down with a list of sin debts? That they are just coming in. Now, here's the thing. We know that Christ is going to erase all of them. This is a challenge, I think, for us as well, on how do we deal with that person who's new in their walk, that maybe hasn't changed their ways yet, because they're not even maybe completely to the point where they've even put Christ on in baptism. Hopefully at that point, I think the expectation is you have to have changed your ways, because if you're taking off the old self, the practices have to go away with it. And the expectation there is that we're teaching them, and that we're training them, and we're helping them, not harboring negativity about that and saying, look, you got all these problems or whatever, I can't forgive you until you start changing your way, like all these conditional things that we might put on there. But I think we need to be aware too that when somebody comes to Christ, they're coming out of a life that was without Christ. And when they come to our number, from a background that is completely, often, diametrically opposed to what we would live or how we would live our lives, and they come to that saving understanding of Christ, I don't want to say that we need to give them some breathing room kind of thing, to figure it out. I think the expectations are there at baptism that there's got to be an immediate change. And I think we need to be able to tell them that in a loving way, to say, look, all right, here's the thing. If you're going to put on Christ in baptism, this is a full buy-in. This means your old ways have to stop and change. There will be no harboring of any kind of negative thoughts from what you did in the past. Those are all wiped completely clean, and really teaching them and understanding what Christ is doing at that moment as well. And by doing that and verbalizing it sometimes, I think it helps us, first of all, convince them that is truly what we are trying to practice and follow, but it also then commits us to have to practice and follow that. Because it does take, what they used to do. No, I don't need to know what they used to do. I shouldn't be thinking about it anymore. I may know it, but it's got to be out of the front side of my mind. Hard to erase it from the back of your mind, but put it way back, tuck it back in the corner as far as you can get it to you if you can't get it out of your mind, and let them actually put on Christ. and let them actually live their life as a forgiven person. Just because they may have committed more sins than you did prior to coming to Christ, we all committed sins before Christ, and we all need him. And so that idea that if we've been forgiven of all these things that are beyond the capability of any of us paying, then let's extend that same forgiveness to them. Yeah.
Maybe the order is not intended for this purpose, but I believe in the last chapter of Matthew, I think it begins about verse 19. It says, baptize, go into all the world and baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then, that's the first order as I see it. And then the second order is teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have told you. So the burden really lays upon the individual who brings them to Christ, or individuals, in that the teaching of the doctrines of Christ are vital to that growth process. Because the birthing process has to come first, then the teaching.
Yeah.
The same thing would apply with a child who comes into the world in the birthing process.
Good points there.
Now, maybe
No, I think you're right. I think that, you have to, like, the birth is the first part, and then it's training. And the training has to come from the standpoint of, we don't hold your pre-birth life against you. I want to read the next parable because I think it goes so much with this that we would be kind of remiss if we don't get to this particular one. Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and send them into his vineyard. All right, about 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, you also go work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. So they went. And he went out again about noon, and at 3 in the afternoon, and did the same thing. And about 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? Because no one has hired us, they answered. And he said to them, you also go and work in my vineyard. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call all the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first. And the workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. And you know what the guys in the morning are like, oh, wow, we're going to get a lot. We've been here all day. So when those who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and of the heat of the day. I got to see this play out firsthand. Not too long ago, our company raised the minimum wage, and it had some people who'd worked there longer all bumped up, and they were all in the same thing. And I had to tell a few of them, I said, are you going to be negative because somebody else is also now getting what you're making? I said, are you going to forget the fact that you got a raise? Like your raise, it kind of went in. They raised up everybody's minimum wage within the company to a certain level, and it's like, all right, your pay went up. Theirs went up a little bit more. Is that a problem? Are you only happy if you make more than that person? And that's kind of what's in this whole thing. This still plays itself out to this day. We see this in front of us, right in front of us, playing itself out. But he answered one of them, I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. He's being generous, and he's being treated as though he's being unfair. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. So in this one, where do you find what's most relatable where you are on that one? And I think for a lot of us, because we were raised in the church from the earliest day, we were the morning workers. And we've worked the whole day long. And I hope we would never turn around to another who comes in late, in their years and say, well, you haven't been here the whole time. You don't deserve. I would hope we would never treat anybody like that. But do we kind of? That's the thing. We would never say that. Or do we kind of have this little bit of resentment that they squandered their whole life away and never did all this stuff? And, I hope not. But I would say that I think there's some of that that's in there somewhere. So what is fair when it comes to what Christ has done for us, then, is really where the question comes in. What is actually fair? Do we want Christ to be fair? No. Please, no. Listen, we could all say a prayer right now that do not be fair to us. Do not give us what we deserve and what we've earned. All we want is his mercy applied to all. That's what we really want. And if somebody comes in on their deathbed who had lived a horrible life, and I think, I've heard, so many people, we all remember probably one of the most pronounced ones that we can ever think of. If you're thinking of it, you're nodding your head. Who are you going to say? Jeffrey Dahmer. When we hear that one, that is one of the most astounding cases of this parable played out in our lifetimes. And for those who aren't familiar, which I'm sure you probably all are, that a minister of the church in Ohio went to his prison cell after he was a cannibal, not only murdered but ate people, did everything that he was possibly could be considered to be as sinful could be, and he gave his life over to Christ before he was then killed by other inmates. At the very last 11th hour of the 11th hours you could come up with, he gave his life over to Christ and could very well, if it was a true conversion that God will be the judge of, could very well be right next to us in the throne room of heaven, praising our Lord together. How do you feel about that? That's where it's like, okay, you ought to be happy that he finally got it,
After his conversion or his repentance, because he had been in the church, he continually taught the gospel to fellow inmates while he was in prison. And the individual who beat him to death was angry because he just couldn't stand his preaching.
Yeah. Which is amazing to think that what we know from the news stories, what the majority of the world would think of when they look him up, and they, you Google that name, you're going to see all the terrible, terrible deeds that man did. But you know what? Who doesn't remember it? God. Forgiven. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's an amazing story of this kind of played itself out. I don't remember if I have one more bullet point. I do. So again, what's God's reaction to the lost soul repenting at the 11th hour? Great rejoicing in heaven. That a cannibal who was murdering his children finally stopped and turned his life over to him. Rejoicing. What's our reaction? Well, I don't know about that guy. That's the problem, is that we have to find a way to align our heart. That's why we've been looking the last few weeks is how do we see things through God's lens? Because our lens is dirty, scratched up. It's the wrong prescription, whatever it is. We've got to figure out a way to see through his perfect way of looking at things. And it's not easy. It's different. It's looking at things from a different perspective of he's glad that one of his creation stopped murdering other parts of his creation and eating them, and then turning around and lived a life that was for him. That is, again, probably the most drastic you could come up with in our way of thinking. But remember, darkness is darkness. There's a lot of people who lived a life of darkness, and if we don't... Now, here's one thing. Let me not mention what happened. There was a man who was in prison who, for deeds that he had done, gave his life over. Oh, that's great. That's great. See, when we don't mention how dark the darkness is, because it's not ranked, darkness is darkness. And when we see somebody come from darkness to light, we should rejoice with them. Whether they come at the morning, 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., or 5 p.m., whatever it is, or the 11th hour, that they come at the very end of the day, that we should be glad that they went. That's what God is. He rejoices that they've come in. Not, well, we're going to dock your pay because you missed the first, 7 hours of the day. It's very different there. Any final thoughts?